This is a map of the Algarve. Our bike route is on the side. However, we spent extra time on the Algarve. That's Lynn, Becky, and myself, both before the bike trip and after. Before, we were in Faro, which is almost bottom right on your screen. Wes is pointing to it. And then after the bike trip, we were in a place called Praia de Lutz, which isn't marked by name, but it's just about 7 kilometers west of Lagos at the other end of the Algarve.
Right there.
West of Lagos, other side. That side, yes, down on the coast there, where sort of those roads dip down to the coast, a bit further closer to Lagos, but in that general vicinity.
Oh, okay.
A bit further along there. That's about it. Somewhere in that vicinity there, Praia de Lutz. Okay, next. This is us arriving in the old cobbled stone walled city of Faro. It still has an old walled city. And we had rented an apartment on the ground floor of this house. Next. This is our ground floor. We had a little central courtyard and we had an eating area outside. The kitchen is just behind. And we had, as I say, 2 bedrooms, bathroom, and this very nice eating area in the courtyard. Next. We arrived a couple of days, 3 days actually, before Wes and Norm. So we set out to explore Faro, and you'll notice the beautiful jacaranda trees in flower at this time of the year, which is the beginning of June. Next. This is the entrance to the old wall city. And if you look at the top, you'll see all kinds of storks' nests perching on top of the walls up there. There's one with 1 stork, one with 2 storks, and one right on the very top.
And,
and then there's one over to the right-hand side as well. Storks' nests were very prolific in this town. And since they in Europe think they're good luck, nobody ever moves them on. Next. This is one of the old churches which we explored. We, as I say, spent a day wandering around exploring the sites of Faro. The next day, and I, in the interests of not duplicating too many old towns left out, we took a train for 2 hours to the east to a town called Talvera and explored the old town there before training back. One of the things in the Algarve is that there is a train that runs right from the Spanish border through Faro right out to Lagos. But where we were west of Lagos later, you had to have a car because the train didn't go any further. Next. We've had that stork picture on the previous one. Both Norm and myself fancied that picture. Next. This is from high up in the cathedral, looking down onto the part of the old town. Those trees are orange trees. And out beyond that, you can see the ocean, but the ocean in this area and to the east of us is almost lagoon style, because there are a lot of very low-lying islands full of bird life, but not necessarily going to find your best beaches here unless you go out to the outer part of the islands, which means if you wanted to go to beaches in Faro, you normally had to take a ferry out to the islands. Next. This is us having a dish called a seafood cataplana, served in a copper pot. It had large prawns, sea bass, multiple seafoods, mussel, oyster, prawns in a sauce with potatoes and fried bread on top. That theoretically is a serving for 2. Well, 3 of us couldn't get through it, never mind 2. It was huge, but it was very, very good. Next. One of the evenings, we went up to a sort of nightclub restaurant area that's up in the castle walls, the old wall city part, and listened to a fado singer. This is the slightly mournful kind of music that is traditional in Portugal. If any of you are going on the Wells Grey tour to Portugal to Lisbon in May, I believe it is, I am quite sure you will go and listen to some fado. Next. Now we're doing a bit of a skip from Faro for 3 days, with Wes and Norm joining us on the last day. We went on the bicycle trip. They picked us up from the last hotel on the bike trip and took us to Lagos, where they dropped Becky, Lynn, and myself outside a car rental agency enterprise, and then carried on taking Norm and Wes back to the Faro airport. We picked up a car and drove here to Praia de Lutz. And we are in a townhouse, standing on our balcony, looking down at the water and beach below. Praia de Lutz is, we thought, a very attractive town to be in. It's got enough development. You could eat in a different restaurant every night, but it's not so overdeveloped and not so massively high-rising as some of the resorts are, that you feel it's been seriously overdeveloped. From where we were, it was just about a block and a half down to the beach. We could walk down in our swimsuits to swim, which we did pretty well every day. At least Becky and I got right into swim, and Lynn did quite a bit of paddling. On the weekends, this beach can get quite crowded because it's so close to Lagos, but the rest of the time it had people, but it wasn't supremely crowded. Next. We, one morning, quite early in the morning, Becky and I climbed up to the cliffside on the east side of Praia de Lutz and had this view looking down at Lutz. And as you see, it's a totally sort of whitewashed town. And if you look near the far end of the beach on the right, you can see some townhouses, and we're sort of in the second row there. Next. Again, the whitewashed town had a lot of bougainvillea everywhere. It just really was quite attractive. Next. Interesting chair.
Mm-hmm.
Next. And this is us having sangria at one of the outside restaurants. We ate outside practically every day here. Next. And that's us going out into the water to swim. There was some wave, but the surf was nothing like we had on the beaches when we were bicycling. All the beaches on that Atlantic side were clearly surfing beaches, whereas those on the Algarve are predominantly swimming beaches. You can play in the waves. They're not so big or so dangerous that you can't have fun in them. Next. And that's Lynn walking down the beach. We did quite a bit of beach walking. Commonly, we were on the beach, usually sort of 3:30 to 5:30 kind of time when the burn was off the sun. We were out exploring, hiking, whatever, in the mornings, and then having often a late lunch and a sort of short rest before we came out and explored the beach. Next. One day, we did go over to the Atlantic coast, further sort of in a section where we weren't biking. We were on that last day going down to Cape St. Vincent, and we were mostly inland. And we went out to the cliffs there. And again, you can see these are the Atlantic surfing beaches, and literally nobody on them. If they didn't have a surf school, they were deserted. Next. Flowers. June's a great month for flowers, wildflowers, domestic flowers, all flowers. Next. One of the days, we went to walk out to the point of land near Lagos, and they have a very nice cliff walk there. And all along the Algarve cliffs, this is just one section, we'll see another section later, you find grottos, arches, caves, all kinds of formations. And we were walking along the cliff here out to the point, taking in some of these formations. Next. That's again looking down at one of the little beaches. Sea stacks are also common. Next. The following day, we took ourselves further along the coast. We drove past Lagos and kept going. We drove for about 55 minutes to a place called Almira de Pena, I believe, or something close to that, where we were joining a boat excursion to go and look at the caves, sea stacks, and grottos that are quite well known around a place called Benagil. You can walk along the cliffs there as well, but we decided we'd have a look at them from the sea. That is not actually our boat, but it's a boat by the same company. It's going to be our boat when they brought it in and we've climbed aboard. Next. And this is, we had a very excellent captain. A lot of the boat captains of these tourist boats were formerly fishermen, and they have slightly changed their livelihood to run these tour boats, but they can maneuver right in so that you can look up through the hole in the rock up above you. Next. Arches, beautiful arches. Next. Sea stacks. Next. And this is one of the most famous with this hole here, and this is the one actually at Benagil. And when we got there, we found in this area, there were a lot of people visiting the same caves by kayak. They hadn't come from quite so far away as us. They'd come from a nearby beach, and were quite a lot of kayaks are in the water, in the cave here. And as I say, it was a very popular activity in this particular area. Next. One day we decided to hike from our village over to the next one going west, called Burgau. Now, if anybody looks at our pictures of Praia de Lutz and thinks, oh, well, that looks like it's too developed, and by Algarve standards, it's not that developed, just go one further over to Burgau, which is where we're walking to, and it's even less developed. It's just that bit further away from Lagos, I think. And as I say, these ones at this side of Lagos, the west side, don't have the train. So as I say, people are dependent on car rental. Next. That is the little village of Burgau. And it has, as you can see, a beautiful beach. And as I say, is quite small still. I think it will grow. There's a tendency for everything along the coast here to develop. But if anybody's looking for the really quiet one, this is the one. Next. Lovely old street lined with the blue and white houses heading down towards the waterfront. While we were in Burgau, I thought this is just another, the next one's fine, just showing a rather attractive house along the way. While we were here, an almighty windstorm blew up. We were fortunately in a cafe at the time who battened all the hatches, and we all stayed inside till it blew past, but you could almost see it rolling in off the sea. And then, as I say, we were able to hike back again. Next. On our last day, rather than going directly back to Faro, because our flight wasn't until the evening and we were overnighting at an airport hotel, we took an excursion inland to a place called Silves, which has an old Moorish castle, which is quite visible on this slide. Next. And this is inside the Moorish castle. It's quite well preserved in terms of the outside walls. You don't see, obviously, much of the inside buildings. It's mostly just walls that you could walk all the way around. Next. Okay, this is now moving after we flew out of Faro. I might add we had a bit of a kerfuffle with our flight with EasyJet the next morning, but we eventually got to England. We had been concerned that the trains were going to go on strike while we were in England. And so we covered our bets by booking a bus most of the way to the Cotswolds, but we had missed it because of the flight kerfuffle. But the trains were still running on the outbound trip to Moreton in the Marsh. I'll tell you about our adventures getting back at the end. If you look at this map, you can see Moreton in the marsh, slightly there. Wes has his, and we were doing an in-to-in walking trip with a company called Max Adventures. And Max Adventures, unlike U-Tracks, not only gave us digital instructions, but gave us superb ordnance survey maps, 4 centimeters to 1 kilometer. The maps literally showed every field. However, with the map and the trail markings in the Cotswolds, which are superb, it wasn't difficult to find your way around. In fact, it was extremely easy. Just below Moreton, going south, you'll see a place called Stow in the Wold. We made a point of visiting that because it was on Rick Steves', one of his 2 favorites in the Cotswolds. We originally had been supposed to walk onto Bourton on the Water, carrying on down south, but they couldn't get us into Bourton on the Water at the time we wanted it. So they were going to we had to go back to Moreton in the Marsh. We actually used some buses because they were going to give us a free taxi ride the next day to where we wanted to start. So we used the buses the first day and went part way down to Stow on the Wold, and then swung out to Broadwell, and then wandered around from Broadwell into Stow on the Wold, and then out the other side to Upper and Lower Swell. And then the next day, we skipped over to a place called Norton, which if you go across to the left from Stow in the Wold is where we started our next one. And you can see our line there through Gooting Power up to Winchcombe. And then the next day we took a bus going north up to Stanton and walked out to Snow Hill, up from Winchcombe, back to Winchcombe over there, up to Stanton. And then, as I say, up through Snow Hill to Broadway to Chipping Campden and back to Moreton. We did shorten the hikes the first day, and we cut out Bourton to Norton the second day, and we cut out Winchcombe to Stanton and altered our route a bit because they did have some 21k days, and that was too long for us. We wanted maximum 15 and averaging around 13. So we did shorten them down by using the buses, which was quite easy. Okay, next. This is arriving at the Reddersdale Arms. It was one of the inns that we stayed at. We were nearly all in inns. They were quite attractive. They not very modern. This one, I think, was about 1567, because I remember the one we went to next was about 7 years older, 1574, but not exactly modern. But they had a modern extension out the back of this one through what had been their parking area, and that's where we stayed. Next.
England.
This is us walking through Bridewell, through the church area, with some very attractive trees in this area. Next. This is one of the old trees in the churchyard. Next. As I mentioned, flowers everywhere, both in the Algarve and in England. Next. And again, lovely green, leafy lanes to walk down. Next. And this is arriving at Stow in the Wold. And Stow in the Wold claims to have the oldest inn in England, dating back to the 900s. Although it's been so much renovated, most people hold that claim slightly with a bit of a pinch of salt, because how much of the original building is left is very debatable. Very typical of the Cotswold villages, this stone. We saw it all over the Cotswolds in the villages. Next.
Oh, God. God, didn't pay you enough, Helen.
No, you didn't. Actually, it's a very good photo of you, Lynn. As I say, remnants of the medieval life still hang around here. Next. And this is the old church door with the yew trees around it. Next. And inside this church, the most beautifully embroidered cassocks, and we couldn't find two that were the same, all done by the parishioners. The kneeling on. Next. The following day, as I mentioned, we took a taxi across to Norton, and before we left Norton, we visited this building, which is a historic dovecot. It's a preserved building. Next. And this is inside the dovecot. And if you look carefully, you'll see there are still doves here. They're still using it. In the old medieval days, only the lord of the manor and the abbot were allowed to have dovecots. So this one must have belonged to the local lord of the manor, because we didn't see any abbeys or in the vicinity. Next. This is one of the many what they call kissing gates that we went through following our way across to Winchcombe. We were on a track most of the way with a very simple name called the Winchcombe Way. So it wasn't particularly confusing where you were going. Next. Just showing some of the countryside we're walking through. Green and flowers, wildflowers. Next. More flowers. That one looks like it belongs to the orchid family.
Orchid.
It is an orchid.
Yes. Next. Again, just showing the kinds of paths and fields we're walking through. Next. And now we've come to Winchcombe, which again has a lot of medieval building remnants in it. This is where, as I say, our inn was 7 years newer than the other one at 1574. Next. In fact, that white building, the White Hart, was our inn.
Yes, yeah.
We ate our dinners in a lot of the pubs, because in England, the pub food is nearly always better value for money than the restaurants. Next. The following day, we're on our way again. More lovely green paths. Next. This is looking across towards Snow Hill. That is on the far side, and we're heading over to that village and also to a National Trust house in the area. Next. This is the village. The Cotswolds, not surprisingly, is listed in Britain as an area of outstanding natural beauty. Natural and man-made. Next. And this is the house that we were at, Snow Hill Manor, and we're having our lunch just outside before doing a tour of the building. The house was actually in the hands of a gentleman called Charles Paget, who was a real eccentric in the early 1900s. He filled his house with the most eclectic mix of stuff you've ever seen in all your life. Next. That's him. Oh, sorry, Charles Wade, not Paget. Oh, next, or it might have been Charles Paget Wade. Maybe that P is Paget. I had it down in my notes as Paget. Next. This is some of the stuff he collected. Samurai suits of armor. As I say, there was no rhyme or reason to his collection. Every room he went in was something totally different. Just things he'd picked up as he went around. Next. This is in the gardens of the manor. And we're now just wandering out the bottom of this garden to hike our way onto a town called Broadway. Next. Okay, I'll carry on. As you can see, we arrived at Broadway and went and had a cream tea, which is scones, strawberry jam, and clotted cream. Okay, next. In the evening, this is one of the pubs we had dinner at. And as you can see, the lovely blue sky, our weather was so nice that we actually had our dinner outside. And we had a Evesham pie, which is a variation of the steak pie. Next. That is the Broadway Tower in the distance. Our next day's walk from Broadway started by walking up to this tower. It's 1,000 feet up, which in that part of England is about as high as it gets. And it gave great views around the countryside in every direction. Next. That's the tower close up. And it was built, as many of these buildings were, as a folly, but the landlord who built it, I guess, also built it to give himself great views of all the surrounding countryside. We didn't go inside it, it wasn't. We just looked at the views from around it. Next. Wasn't even open, I don't think. More flowers along the way. Next. This is a right of way. For those who are not familiar with England and its right of ways, if there is a historic right of way connection between two villages, we're going back into the past now, before the motor cars, no farmer can close that right of way as long as it's walked at least once a year. Well, the ones in the Cotswolds are probably walked every hour, never mind once a year. But the Ramblers organization in Britain does have coordinators in every region to make sure every single right of way is walked at least once a year, and they log who walked it. So if any farmer tries to cut off the right of way, or a golf course or a developer or anybody tries to close off a right of way, they're in trouble. Occasionally, if it's in a critical location, they can get permission to reroute it, but they can't get permission to close it. And this is a classic example of a right of way running right through the farmer's field. Next. We then came to Chipping Campden for the night, and Chipping Campden is noted for this medieval market in the middle of the main street, where they used to hold, obviously, probably a lot of sheep markets. One of the things that this Cotswolds and the World Wold is the fold. This whole area at one time was one big sheep farm. And in some of the villages, you could walk down alleys where they herded the sheep to the market. In fact, we did walk down one or two of them in different places. Stowe in the Wold had some good sheep alleys leading to the centre area where they were bringing the sheep into market. Next. We're off again now, and just past this lovely field of poppies. Next. Just an attractive row of cottages we passed in a very small village. Well, it wasn't even a village, it was a little hamlet we went past. Next. Apart from the kissing gates, we also had stiles. These were not uncommon ways of getting over fences. Next. This is showing you the signage on these trails. As you could see at one point, we're on both the Monarch's Way and the Heart of England Way. Sometimes the two different ways overlap each other for a stretch, and then they'll go off on divergent ways. But as I say, they do make it extremely easy. If you looked at your map and you know that you need to be on the Heart of England Way, or you need to be on the Monarch's Way, or the Winchcombe Way, or the Cotswold Way, we were all on parts of those at one time or another, it makes it extremely easy to navigate your way across the countryside. Next. And this is looking down at one of the small towns. I believe we're actually on our way back down into Moreton. Next. And this is the final one. We're back at the Reddersdale Arms in Moreton, and I'm holding in my hand a unique feature of this inn. I have been to many inns in many places in the world where they provide me with free tea and coffee. But the Reddersdale Arms provided me all 3 nights I was there, and Lynn in the other room, with a decanter of sherry. So you didn't have to go out and buy your happy hour. It was presented to you in your room to enjoy. And it didn't come like our bar liquor in the fridges where you pay for it. It was given to you for free, which was a very nice fitting at the end of the day. The final chapter of our trip was getting back from Moreton in the Marsh to Gatwick Airport, because by now the trains had gone on strike. But as I mentioned, we had booked a bus from Oxford. So we arranged with the local taxi driver who'd driven us on the second day to drive us into Oxford to catch the bus. And that part went fairly smoothly. And we eventually arrived at Gatwick, not too early in the day, probably about, 5 o'clock, was it, Lynn?
Yeah.
And then our trials and tribulations started. Because the trains were on strike, everybody arriving at Gatwick, who relied on things like the train to take them to London, and the trains run probably every 10 minutes from Gatwick to London, there wasn't a taxi to be had in the place to get to our overnight bed and breakfast in Hawley, which is quite near the airport, but not close enough to walk. The buses were just as bad. The fact that they were almost overwhelmed, and we couldn't find a bus going to Hawley either. We waited and watched the buses going past. We went to and from the taxi stand. About 2 hours later,
Yes.
as we were wondering how on earth we were going to get to our B&B, we phoned the B&B and explained that we were stranded, and the landlord, God bless his heart, came and fetched us. So, and not only that, he took us back to the airport in the morning. So that solved our problem of the fact that because of the train strike, the whole bus and taxi system at Gatwick was in total confusion. And we were just thankful we'd booked the bus to get from Oxford to Gatwick to cover off the fact that the trains weren't running. And with that, we then next day caught our plane back to Canada. But the Cotswold is a lovely area to walk in, and certainly Max Adventures, with whom we went, we couldn't fault them for the accommodation, the maps they gave us, or anything that they did, and their flexibility in terms of the fact that they were willing to help us start in a slightly different place than the one that was listed. And I think that was the end of that part of the slideshow. And I think next week it's going to be Norman Wes on Hadrian's Wall.